Good morning and welcome to the fifth meeting in 2021 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. We've started a wee bit later this morning because of some technical gremlins, so those who wanted to watch earlier, we apologise for that. In the meantime, we have apologies this morning from Anna Sarwar and Jackie Bailey, and James Kelly will be Jackie Bailey's substitute. The only item on our agenda this morning to take evidence as part of our budget scrutiny from the Scottish Fiscal Commission and then from Kate Forbes, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. I welcome our first panel witnesses from the Scottish Fiscal Commission to the meeting. They include Dame Susan Rice, who is the Chair, Professor Alistair Smith, a Commissioner, Professor Francis Breeden, a Commissioner also, and John Ireland, who is the Chief Executive. Welcome to you all. And I would invite Dame Susan Rice to make some brief opening remarks. Thank you. Over to you, Dame Susan.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to all of you, and thank you for asking us to give evidence. I'll just take a few minutes and share some headlines from our report. COVID obviously made the last year really tough for everybody. Both the Scottish and UK economies were significantly affected, contracting by 11% in 2020. We expect that the current lockdown will reduce economic activity by a further 5% this quarter. However, our forecast for 2021 as a whole is for growth of about 2%, rising to 7% next year. We expect COVID to affect the economy for a long time. We think it'll be 2024 until GDP returns to the level it was before the pandemic, and we expect unemployment to remain elevated over the forecast. There's an important consequence of our forecast this year. For the first time, our forecasts, along with those of the OBR, have triggered a Scotland-specific economic shock. This means that the Scottish Government will get additional borrowing powers for the next 3 years to manage forecast errors. The shock arose because the OBR's November 2020 forecasts were made before the current lockdown was even announced. So they took a more optimistic view of the UK economy for the beginning of 2021 than we've done now for Scotland. At this stage, we don't see any stark difference in how the pandemic has affected the Scottish and UK economies. As in previous years, income tax revenues contribute more than the reduction in the budget from the block grant adjustment. The net position of income tax in the 21-22 budget is now forecast to be £475 million, an increase from £155 million in our pre-pandemic forecast. This is because we're now forecasting that between this year and next, Scottish income revenue will grow 3.5%, compared with a 1% growth in the BGA, based on the OBR's income tax forecast. We believe this difference largely arises from uncertainty around COVID and its effects in the data and judgments used by both organizations. COVID is an exceptional event. We don't expect a divergence unrelated to economic factors or policy to happen in other years. If the net position of income tax in the budget proves to be too large, there will be a negative reconciliation in the order of £300 million in 24-25. In our previous forecast, we've said the devolution of taxes and social security introduces additional risk into managing the Scottish budget. We're clear that in 2021 and next year, the budget management challenge is different than previously and much more risky. Any variation in the budget due to tax revenues and social security payments has been far surpassed by the scale of the pandemic-related funding from the UK government. COVID funding increased successively over the course of this year from £3.5 billion in April to the latest estimate of £8.6 billion. Overall, resource funding has increased by 21% since the budget was introduced a year ago. Next year's resource budget has been set at £1.8 billion of COVID funding, but given the uncertain nature of the pandemic and the tightening of restrictions across the UK since November, there may well be further changes in funding in next month's UK budget, and even later in the year as well. This means the Scottish Government will likely continue to have to hit a moving target when managing its finances. Overall, our view is that the Scottish Government's plans to use the reserve and resource borrowing to manage the budget are reasonable during an exceptional year, but we recognise that the ongoing uncertainty means these plans may change significantly. So that's my high-level overview. We'll all divvy up the questions as you have them, and we're very happy to take them now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dame Susan. That was a very helpful overview and a very helpful opening remarks, so thank you very much. Now, obviously, the committee acknowledges the difficulty you've faced in the SFC in producing forecasts in these highly challenging and volatile circumstances. We're also well aware of the complexities of, obviously, on top of all of that, of the fiscal framework. What we're struggling somewhat with is to understand why your income tax forecast so much higher than the OBR forecast, when the opposite is the case for your GDP growth forecast. So I think it would be very interesting to understand what are the key differences in the judgments you've made and the OBR might have made in underpinning your respective forecasts, and why that apparent contradiction is part of the forecast.
So thank you for that question, and it is genuinely pertinent, and it sounds I hope not flippant to say a lot of the difference is a timing difference, but actually it's rather more complicated than that. And what I'll do is ask Alistair if he would like to come in to begin with to respond to the question, because he's very articulate on this. Alistair, can I hand over to you?
Thanks, Susan. Yes, well, I'll do my best. It is indeed a very important question, convener, which you asked about our forecast, because as Susan said in her opening remarks, there is a timing difference between our forecasts, which were done in January, and the OBR forecasts, which underlie the BGA, which were done in November. And that's resulted in our forecast for the overall economy being more pessimistic than the OBR's forecast. But as you've pointed out, convener, that doesn't really explain the difference between our income tax forecasts, where we're, if you like, more optimistic than the forecast derived from the OBR. And what perhaps is worth starting off where we were last year in our forecasts for this year. The combination of our forecast and the OBR forecast suggested that the Scottish budget would get a net addition of about 150 million, I think, from income tax. Since then, the pandemic has come along. The OBR has adjusted its forecasts. We've adjusted our forecasts. Both of us are now making income tax forecasts that are substantially reduced, but the OBR's forecasts have gone down by more than ours. So the OBR reduced its income tax BGA by £950 million, while our forecast of income tax revenue has gone down by much less, with the result that we're now got a net difference between the two forecasts of £475 million, £320 million more than our previous forecast. And frankly, that's out of line with past data on income tax outturns. For example, in the last outturn year of 2018-19, the net outturn for the Scottish budget was 120 million. So our earlier forecast of last year was more or less in line with that. And it's very hard to explain why that number should now have been boosted by almost £500 million. There's no obvious reason why our forecast of income tax should be more. Our forecast of the income tax reduction should be much less than the OBR's forecast, since broadly speaking, we don't see evidence that the economic effects of the COVID pandemic have been very different in Scotland from from in the rest of the UK. So that's, apologies, a long introduction to trying to answer your question, but it's important to set the framework. First of all, what I'd say is we all know from past discussions that relatively modest differences between forecasts, our forecast and the OBR forecasts, can generate quite large reconciliations. We're both trying to estimate a number that's of the order of £12 billion, and relatively small differences on divergences can lead to significant gaps. But turning to the effects of the pandemic on our forecasts, it's really important to appreciate the uncertainties with which tax forecasters, both in the SFC and the OBR, have had to grapple with in current circumstances. The pandemic has broken the normal connections between GDP on the one hand and employment and earnings on the other. So when you look at our forecast in the summary which you have, our forecast for this year indicates that we think that Scottish GDP fell by over 10% in 2020 compared with 2019. But employment fell by only 2.5%, and earnings actually seem to have risen in 2020 by 2.5%. Now, in an ordinary recession, a fall in GDP of 10% would have been accompanied by similar falls in earnings and in employment. That didn't happen in 2020 because there were deliberate policy interventions by government, by both governments, to safeguard employment. Specifically, the furlough scheme kept workers in employment and earning wages, even if they were not actually working. The pandemic, we know, has also had effects on income distribution. The incomes of the well-off have been largely unaffected by the enforced downturn in economic activity, while the incomes of many low-paid workers and families have suffered in the pandemic. And since a high proportion of income tax revenue comes from the higher paid, that's going to have an effect on tax revenue. Last point to make is that the pandemic has affected the reliability of data because the statistical agencies are collecting economic data in much more difficult circumstances than in a normal year. So what's happened is that in this highly uncertain environment, the OBR and the Fiscal Commission seem to have made some different judgments about how to interpret the data and how to use the data. We've made a lot of use of HMRC's RTI, real-time information data on employment and earnings and tax receipts, to try and track what really happened in the very difficult circumstances of the year and what's likely to be happening in 2021. While the OBR has given more weight to labour force survey data. The OBR data also includes information from self-assessment, which is not included in the RTI tax receipts data, although it's a relatively small fraction of tax revenue. And it's these different judgments about data that we think are probably the biggest source of the forecasting difference that has led to this addition, compared with last year's forecast, of £475 million into the Scottish budget. And obviously it's a source of anxiety whether this £475 million is a real increase to the budget that the government can safely spend, or whether, as Susan suggested in her opening remarks, it's an artifact of the difference between the two forecasts. And when in 2023 the outturn for tax in 21-22 comes along, we find that 475 wasn't really there, and the Scottish Government budget will be faced by a reconciliation. So that's the issue that we face, and I hope I've explained why we think it's largely the product two organisations making forecasts at different times and facing really quite unprecedented difficulties in forecasting income tax revenue at this time. Well, apologies for my answer, but it's an important issue, and I know you're concerned about it.
Yeah, I think it was important to give us a pretty lengthy answer, I think, in terms of the detail you've just given us there, Alistair. I've got one other follow-up question, Alistair. In terms of the normal models that you quite rightly described, being broken, the difference between GDP and income tax growth. And I guess the real challenge for you is now you're trying to do forecasting, looking into a crystal ball that's incredibly misty, smoky, and you can hardly see anything what's going on in the real term future. So that brings huge risks, because you talked about the relative difference in the forecasts producing significant gaps. And obviously, what I'm concerned about, therefore, now is the level of risk that will inevitably arrive from these different judgments and the impact of the reconciliation of forecasts and the outturn in 24-25. And it might seem a bit further down the road, but because of the system we work with, we've got to look that far ahead. So what are the risks for 2024-25? How large are they? And do we have enough flexibility in the fiscal framework to deal potentially with a significant level of risk?
Well, if the 475 in the Scottish Government budget, it remains in the budget during the year, it's spent, then but then it turns out in 2023 that the outturn was way out of line with that, then there will, as you've indicated, have to be a reconciliation in the 24-25 budget. And if that reconciliation is of the order of 400 or 500 million, then it's larger than the current borrowing powers of the Scottish Government. So on the face of it, there is an issue. However, I wouldn't focus too much on the question of what's going to happen in 2025. We're going to have a review of the fiscal framework before then, and everything that's happened this year will have provided interesting material for whoever is reviewing the fiscal framework to think about and to consider that question. I think the more important issue is to think about what the Scottish Government should do this year, given that it has got this addition to its budget for 2021-22, that our best guess is that it's a slightly artificial increase by this forecasting difference. It might, for example, be that when the OBR produces a new set of forecasts at the end of March to go alongside the UK government budget, that the OBR might well revise its view of income tax forecast. And the BGA might get revised then at that point. Now, if the BGA came down by a few hundred million in March, then under the arrangements which are agreed for this year, when the two budgets are out of line with the usual practice, the Scottish Government could choose to go with the existing block grant adjustment and leave the £475 million in the budget, or it could, if hypothetically there is a lower block grant adjustment, the Scottish Government could revise the budget to use the amount of the excess in the budget. However, I think the one really important point to emphasize is that there's a huge amount of budget uncertainty this year because of COVID expenditure. Last year, the Scottish Government got £8.5 billion of additional expenditure in steps during the year, some of it quite late in the 2020-21 financial year. The budget which is before you now has got £1.8 billion of additional funding for COVID. 1.3 of it comes from the UK, from UK funding decisions in November at the time of the UK spending review. And the Scottish Government is estimating that it will get another £500 million of COVID funding during the year. Now, we think that given all the uncertainties about how COVID is going to develop over the year, that assumption which the government is making in its budget of an additional £500 million is a pretty modest and cautious assumption. So against the scale of the likely pressures and changes in the budget during the coming year that are going to be associated with the evolution of the pandemic, this income tax issue, I'm not trying to talk it away, it is a real issue, but it's not a huge issue relative to the scale of all the other uncertainty.
Yeah.
And yeah. I think what I'm saying is we can't ignore it. It's a significant issue, but it's an issue that we can be relatively relaxed about for the moment, and perhaps later in the year, when we've seen how 2021 has evolved, will be the better time to judge whether this is, if you like, a little quirk of the fiscal framework where two forecasts made at different times has given the Scottish Government a modest but welcome relaxation in its borrowing power. Because after all, that's what a reconciliation is. A reconciliation, an addition to the budget followed by a reconciliation is effectively an interest-free loan to the Scottish Government for a couple of years, which then would have to be repaid in 2025. In the current circumstances, an additional loan of £500 million might be regarded as welcome. Or later in the year, when we all of us review the numbers, we might think, well, no, there is an issue here which needs to be tackled, but later in the year is probably the better time to tackle it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And can I hand over to Murdo Fraser now, please? Murdo.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to Dame Susan and colleagues, and thank you for your responses to the Convener. I just want to follow up a couple of points around forecasting, and just to put that in context, I do accept everything that's just been said about the unprecedented nature of the times we are in and the difficulty there is in forecasting. So this is not intended as a criticism before I get into my questions. I just wanted to ask you about your forecast economic growth for next year. You're forecasting it at 1.8% in 2021, and then a big rise to 7.5% in 2022. I mean, that is quite far out from what the OBR were forecasting, albeit their forecast was done back in November. But I note that the Treasury do publish every month a summary of economic forecasts, and their most recent forecast published in January projected UK growth in 2021 at 4.5%, which is quite a lot higher than what you're forecasting for Scotland. Is there any particular reason you're taking such a pessimistic view compared to the surveys that the Treasury are highlighting?
So again, a very good question, something that might be in the minds of a lot of people. I will turn to another of my colleagues, Francis, just in a minute to give you a detailed answer, but let me just say at the beginning that these forecasts are all really quite time dependent. So if you look quarter by quarter at the OBR forecast, if you look at Treasury, Bank of England very recently came out with a forecast as well. If the growth begins in the second quarter this year, it makes a difference overall, quite a lot of difference, or if it's shown to start a little bit sooner or a little bit later. So, and again, these forecasts are all made at a different point in time. I think the differences do not reflect the fact that we're being particularly pessimistic. We used the data and the information we had at our point in time, at the point when our economy forecast closed, which was a couple of weeks ago in January. But Francis, do you want to give a little more detail about some of these differences?
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Susan. Yes. Yeah. No. I think, as you say, it's all the timing. As you've already heard, looking back to forecasts made last year, including the OBR forecasts, the second lockdown was not expected by many of those forecasts, and indeed, when you look at the Treasury survey, quite a few of those forecasts were made in that period. So one of the reasons we became pessimistic relative to the survey is that we had the second lockdown in, whilst not every forecast in the survey had that. But then, as Susan's also pointed out, since we made our forecasts, actually things have somewhat improved on the COVID front because the rollout has actually been quicker than we expected. And indeed, as Susan points out, the Bank of England forecast has a relatively quick return to normalcy compared to what we had, because they expect the rollout to help speed things up. But I think you can sort of judge from my answer that it's not just timing in terms of when the forecast was made. It's also just timing, a few weeks, a couple of months different in when the COVID restrictions are lifted or not, makes a huge difference to growth in 2021. Although, again, as your question implied, it comes out in the wash because it gets pushed. We have a very strong 22 because as a result. So what we're really talking about is, a couple of months difference in how the restrictions play out. And because the restrictions have such a powerful impact on GDP when they're in place, those small differences in assumptions can make big differences to, not to the long run forecast, but to the path of recovery.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I wonder if I can ask a follow-up question on a slightly tangential issue, which is your forecasts on employment, unemployment, and earnings growth. Because I see, compared to UBR, you're projecting slower employment growth in Scotland. Again, that could just be down to the timing issue. Higher unemployment in Scotland than the OBR predicts for the UK, or estimates for the UK. But when it comes to earnings growth, you're predicting quite substantially higher earnings growth in Scotland compared to what the OBR predicts for the UK. Can you explain how all these figures reconcile with each other?
You want to pick up on that, or do you want me to kick off?
Shall I start off? I think there isn't a very helpful answer to this, in the sense that it is, as we've been saying, the relationship with all these numbers between each other has broken. So normally when if you know one of the numbers, you can pretty much predict roughly what the other ones are going to do, and this is not the case. And clearly things like the timing of restrictions being taken off is a key part of that story. So I'm not sure, unless someone like John White want to add something in more detail on. So I'm not sure there's a very sort of helpful answer to your question.
There would be one thing, which is, I think Alistair mentioned, possibly you did, Francis, that we used the RTI data, which we've been talking to the Finance Committee about in previous sessions, and we used those data in January, and they give us real time, which is what the RT stands for, information about employment and about earnings, and for Scotland. And we felt that this was a better snapshot of what was happening here than the Labour Force survey, which is a survey, so it's spot in time and compares back to a pre-COVID base. So it's really using different information in part that has led us to this. We think it was absolutely right to use the RTI data in this instance, much closer to made us closer to what was really happening on the ground very recently, just in the last number of weeks. But John, you may well want to give some more nuance to this.
No, I think it's that sort of, there's a whole range, as we've talked about before, to you about sort of alternative sources of earnings data. And there are also alternative sources of data on unemployment and employment. And I think What's probable is that the OBR have relied more on those alternative sources, including the LFS, but not uniquely the LFS. And we've relied more upon this real-time information. And as you'll remember, the real-time information actually does provide us with data on earnings and employment and also tax receipts. And it's certainly the case that the ONS, the provider of the LFS, has warned about using its sort of changes and levels in employment. They put out a couple of things which have sort of warned people against that. Subsequent to the OBR forecast being published. I think it's also the case that in the RTI data, the HMRC data, there's a sort of a fall in employment which occurs in 2020, which isn't evident in the LFS data. So I think it's basically sort of how much do you weigh those two alternative sources of labour market information, and we've sort of pinned our colours very much to the RTI data in this forecast, and in part really because of those warnings from ONS.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much, Margot. Go to Patrick Harvey now. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if we could just move on a bit and look at the slightly longer term picture. There are forecasts, there are differences in the forecast between the Fiscal Commission and the OBR looking a little further ahead than just the coming financial year. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on those differences, but also, what would you say the picture in the years ahead tells us about the questions that remain to be resolved about the way the fiscal framework operates, and perhaps the way in which it wasn't designed to be resilient to serious bumps in the road, such as those we've encountered?
So thank you for what are really two questions, and I think they need two separate answers. The second part about the nature and efficacy of the fiscal framework, and the first one is, looking further ahead, what do we actually see? Let me say a bit about the second part of your question, and then turn to colleagues to give you some of the detail about what we're looking ahead at. The fiscal framework, as you all know, is due to be reviewed later this year, and that was always in the plan. It's interesting to me that it anticipated in its first creation that a situation might happen where there would be a Scotland-specific economic shock. And of course, that has come into play this forecast round. So it actually anticipated quite a range of types of activities that could happen. We in the Fiscal Commission, however, are not in the job, if you will, of commenting on the efficacy of the fiscal framework. That's an agreement between the two governments, and it is to be reviewed by the two governments. So our involvement would be if in that review we were approached and asked technical questions or asked for clarification about how things worked. In fact, in a pragmatic sense, we would obviously engage as fully as we were required, but we are not able to give a comment about whether it has served its purpose well, whether it would serve future purposes well. We work with what we have, and we have matured in our ability to work with what it offers, and I think we've all gained some understanding, not least your committee, about what is there. So a general answer to that part, but in terms of what we see looking ahead at the economy, again, Francis or John, would either of you like to come in?
Shall I step in first? So in terms of the long term, I mean, this is a really important issue and one that we're going to have to keep monitoring, which is we know that education, training, health are all important long-term determinants of economic growth. And growth, requires good outcomes on those things. And obviously, we've had a difficult time for all those things, and as a result, and in fact, I think pretty much all other forecasters are expecting, permanent impact on the economy from this pandemic. So although we've got this very nasty temporary spike, we also have a permanent one, which is related to these growth determinants being what we call scarring effects of these growth determinants. Now, comparing us with the OBR, it's a little bit difficult to unravel because timing is important. But I think our assessment of the scarring effects are very similar to those of the OBR. So although they, I think, had already brought in some of the effects, I mean, there were other effects like population effects and unemployment effects. They'd already had some of those in their previous forecasts. So I think it doesn't look like they've changed their forecast as much as we have. But I think if you unravel that, I think you find that we and the OBR have taken a relatively similar view on those long-term effects. And those are clearly, important ones that, well, sadly, even once this crisis has passed, are difficult issues we're going to have to manage, and then they will have fiscal implications.
And in the years ahead, if we see, the situation developing roughly in line with the projections that you've given, what do your projections imply for the ability of the Scottish Government to use its borrowing powers to deal with the negative reconciliations that may emerge over the next few years, as far as ahead as you can reasonably see?
Well, I'll start with it. I think this is, maybe Alison wanted to come in. I mean, I think as we said before, the reconciliations that we expect could, as we've done some analysis that show there could be ones that are larger than the borrowing powers currently in the system, and that's going to be, that's obviously a current budget issue, one which will continue in the future. And as Alistair said, there is potentially one on the horizon that is larger than the borrowing powers that is implied by the two forecasts.
Just to clarify something that's come from our advisor as well, you forecast that there could be positive reconciliation applied in 2022-23 and in 23-24. Does that prevent the Scottish Government from using borrowing to deal with negative reconciliations which also take place? Do they offset one another, or are the positive ones disregarded in respect to that borrowing power?
I will pass over to Alistair now, I think, at this point. Yep.
I think
Okay,
John might
sorry.
be able to get some clarity. Yep.
Sorry,
There you go, John.
yes. No, it's the negative ones. They don't cancel out. So if you've got a negative reconciliation, say in LBTT, that allows you to borrow against it, regardless of the fact that you might have an income tax reconciliation which is positive.
So there's no constraint around what the overall net effect is.
That's my understanding, yes. So you borrow against the negative reconciliations; they're not cancelled by the positive.
Thank you very much. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Patrick. John Mason, and John, my apologies, I should have come to you first. So, John Mason.
Thanks, convener. That's all right. Don't worry. Thankfully, Patrick didn't ask the questions I was about to ask. You've said so far that really the COVID has affected the UK and Scotland in broadly similar ways. Is that still the case going forward? I mean, are we pretty sure that Scotland and the UK will be affected similarly this year, the coming 2 or 3 years, or is there any reason to think they will be different?
So that's a pretty big question. But if you look overall, if you look at the year just past, the hit to GDP is roughly similar in Scotland and the UK. We're seeing if you go down into the detail, you always see some differences, but overall, we've seen rather similar, issues through both lenses. So we don't have reason right now to see that there will be a huge divergence in the the impacts going forward. But I don't know, Francis, if you have a view, or Alistair, if you have a view looking ahead.
Well, I can. I'm happy to come in with one additional observation, Susan. I agree with everything you said, of course. Different sectors of the economy are affected by COVID differently. And when we look at the structure of the Scottish economy compared with the rest of the UK economy, there are small differences. The public sector, which is fairly well protected against COVID effects, not completely, is a bit larger in Scotland. The hospitality and tourism sector, which is very badly affected by COVID, is slightly larger in Scotland, so that pulls in the other direction. But those kinds of, when you look at the differences between the Scottish economy and the economy of the rest of the UK, they don't seem to justify any reason to suppose that the effects of the pandemic are going to be fundamentally different. So that underpins our view, not just of what happened this year, but what's likely to happen in the future.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, Murdo Fraser mentioned employment or unemployment, and I'm just wondering what your thinking is when the furlough scheme ends. I mean, there's some suggestions that a lot of businesses did not go bust last year who would normally have gone bust because of the furlough scheme. So, I mean, are we facing a real cliff edge that there could be huge numbers of redundancies when the furlough scheme comes to an end?
So this is a question that is being debated publicly all the time, and it really is hard to pin down. There's a bit of logic that says people have received an income through the furlough scheme, and if the business hasn't survived or cannot survive when the scheme ends, that income will cease. The furlough scheme, as we know, has been extended during the year, in part as the repercussions of COVID have stretched out and extended, so that they've operated in parallel to some extent. So part of this, again, I mean, we keep talking about timing, but part of it is when the furlough scheme ends, is the economy able and ready to pick up? I mean, are some of these businesses able to build? I know individual businesses, we all will do, small businesses, which have been putting huge amounts of effort through perhaps their principals or small number of staff who may be not on furlough but working or on flexible furlough, into building the business so that they're actually ready to set off running as soon as the economy and the world opens up a little bit. Others clearly just can't make a go of it. So I think it's a little hard to say with certainty what will happen, and I think some of this is around timing. But that's my surmise, and I'll turn to colleagues again if someone has a different view to share.
Well,
Francis, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, not a different view, but just specifically on the details of what you were, your question. I mean, it was just a cliff edge, but you were right. There will be a big increase in unemployment. We expect a big increase in unemployment when the furlough ends. So we're assuming that 7% of those on furlough in Q2 will move into unemployment, and so you'll see unemployment rise to 7.6% in Q2. So, you know, there is an impact. But as Susan says, in a sense, the aim of the furlough scheme was to try and make sure that, you know, that unemployment hit was not as big as it could have been, but there is still a hit coming.
Okay, John, anything else?
Yes, I think one final question. I mean, I was going to ask about the £500 million assumption, but I noted the comment that was made that it was modest and cautious. So I shall take that on board. I'll not ask you more on that. So my final one would really be on the underspends for this current year. I mean, I think the figure of 161 million has been used, but are we any clearer? Are we expecting kind of greater underspends this year because so much is closed down?
So could I just say a little bit about underspends and then again turn back to one of my colleagues, probably Francis. This year, any year, there can be underspends because the Scottish Government, as we know, has to balance its budget. And if it has money towards the end of the year, it needs to make sure it has a little bit of excess rather than overspending during the year. This year, of course, with all of the COVID-related or pandemic-related funding, the 8.6 billion that came, some of it came earlier in the year, but some of it quite late in the year, sort of towards November, December. Really hard for a government to develop policies and implement them and begin to spend money when it comes close to the end of a financial year. So this year in particular, it certainly makes sense that there would be some underspends, that money would have to be banked, if you will, and then hopefully used in the following year. Francis, a little more substance than that, perhaps.
But maybe a comment to add to that, which is about the Scottish specific shock, that, as you know, the Scotland Reserve is the key tool for managing underspends and across years, and in normal years there's a drawdown limit on that reserve, which given the volatility of this year would become an issue if the underspends were large. Because of the Scottish specific shock, that drawdown limit is removed, and therefore actually transferring money between years through that mechanism is much easier than it has been in other years. So that's the sort of a welcome result of the Scottish specific shock, given the uncertainty we currently have about spending.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. James Kelly, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. This whole area of forecasting has always been a challenge for the Commission and also for the committee to try and get its head round over recent years. And obviously it's become particularly more difficult because of the pandemic. Can I pick back up with Professor Smith on some of the comments he was making in his initial responses? Obviously key to all this accuracy and forecasting is the use of data. And Professor Smith, you were discussing the differences of data sources between the Commission and the OBR, saying that your preference was to use HMRC data and the OBR was using the Labour Survey data. So in terms of moving forward, as we've just been discussing, clearly when restrictions lift or if the furlough scheme ends, that could have a significant impact on forecasts going forward. So I wanted to explore how quickly you're able to collect data from your data sources in order to start to measure the effects of these changes.
Alistair, I think it was you.
Yeah, Professor Smith.
Yes, on the issue of reacting to new data sources, I agree with you, Mr. Kelly, that the economic situation in 2021 could change rapidly. Indeed, we all hope it's going to change rapidly during the year as the pandemic subsides. One of the reasons why we have made much more use of the real-time information data this year is precisely what it says in the name, that it's information that is coming in real time. So it's information about cash flows coming into HMRC. So one of the big advantages of RTI data is precisely that it gives you quite a quick fix on what's happening in the economy, where other forms of data might be a little bit slower. But I do want to emphasize that it's a matter of forecasting judgment. What's the best data source to use? We've tried to explain why we've given particular emphasis to the RTI data in current circumstances. That seemed to us the best judgment. But it's perfectly proper for other forecasters to make slightly different judgments and come to slightly different conclusions. And that gives rise to issues when our forecasts differ. But we think that we expect to continue to use RTI data during the year precisely because it gives us a quick picture on a situation that might change quite quickly.
Okay, so you
add that the other side of the data picture is outturn data that we use, and the outturn data, depending on what tax or benefit the data is about, comes in different ways. So income tax data, as you know, is about the outturn data, what actually happened for a particular year, comes about 16 months later. So there's a real delay in those data. That won't change. But some of our devolved tax data, we have in-year data, and the data collection has become quite smooth, whether from Revenue Scotland and then more recently Social Security Scotland. So you know, there won't be much change from the past in terms of the timing of those sets of data.
Okay, thanks for that. Just following up on that, Dame Susan, clearly you're pulling all this data in, you're running it through your models, and that's updating the results that you've got, and it's likely to be a very fast-paced situation in terms of change. If your models start to produce materially different results from what you've forecast previously, will you kind of speed up the timetable in terms of publishing that data?
Susan's still muted. Sorry, Susan, you're still on mute, Susan.
Sorry. Yeah. Yep. No, thank you very much. It's a tenor on the table. This happens to us all. We began a program of issuing what we call fiscal updates, sort of short reports on what was happening in fiscal terms over the last year, and we've already signaled that we will continue to do that this year, and actually how important it is to do that this year so that we and you and anyone else who's interested can see what is actually playing out. The data we use pretty much universally will be publicly available data. So we pull the data in from different sources when the data become available. And we're very transparent through our website and so forth about what data we have used. But it is not a matter of our creating the data in any sense that we would keep private. I mean, the data is out there and is publicly available. It's how we pull it in, when we pull it in, and how we use it. And in our fiscal updates, which are not full forecasts because we are usually asked by the Finance Committee to prepare forecasts, but we will comment on what is happening mid-year, which I think is really the point of your question, so that people are up to date with changes of what's happening. So we will do our best in that space, yes.
Okay, thank you. I think welcome up-to-date information is obviously crucial in this situation. Thanks, convener, that's me.
Thank you, James. Most grateful. Dean Lockhart, please.
Thanks very much, convener, and good morning to our panel. I would like to come back to the discussion on average earnings growth. The point has been very well made that the traditional relationship between GDP and tax revenues has broken down because of the exceptional measures taken by government. But I wanted to focus on the relationship between unemployment and wage growth. The SFC is forecasting strong earnings growth in 2021 and 2022, notwithstanding a significant increase in unemployment at that time. I wondered if the SFC could explain the factors underpinning the wage growth forecast at a time when unemployment is also being forecast to rise quite significantly during this period?
So I'll turn possibly to Francis or John to give you some detail, but again, just remind you of something that Alistair said early on, which is that the part of the population which has been most affected by contraction or restrictions around jobs are the lower income earners, and those who earn at moderate and higher levels have not seen that contraction. So there isn't a kind of even reflection in terms of earnings overall. But I don't know, Francis, if you want to say something there, or John, you want to add some clarification?
I'll say something in general, and maybe Sean can say something more specific. I mean, in general, one of the things to note is, you know, again, this situation is so unusual in many ways, but one of the ways it's unusual is going to be that although we'll have a lot of unemployment, we'll have a lot of sort of mismatches across sectors, across skills, you know, also. So we'll see, you know, some sectors really, really hard hit and, you know, struggling, and other sectors, you know, struggling to find the qualified people for what they're doing. So again, that normal relationship where the unemployed put a downward pressure on wages is probably not going to be as strong, because actually there'll be a long period where there's this mismatch where we're trying to match people with jobs, match skills with jobs, and so that's one of the reasons why earnings, the normal, you know, another normal relationship, unemployment and earnings, is not as strong in this type of recovery as you might expect.
Ron, you want to say something?
I think the only thing I'd add to what Francis and Susan have said is just to remind people that the 2019 outturn data for earnings growth was about 4.2%, and our forecasts sort of for 2021 2.6, then 2.4, then 2.7 and 3. So it's true that earnings growth is actually relatively strong in our forecast, but it is also lower than it was in 2019.
Thank you very much. It sounds like there's going to be even greater disparity of earnings between different sectors in that case. And I think that's maybe something we look at in another day. It's maybe not for this discussion, but that was a very interesting response. My other question relates to the forecast for productivity. Productivity is forecast to be relatively flat over the next couple of years, and then show quite a bit of an uptick in 2025, increasing by 1.6%. Again, just wanted to get the views of the SFC to explain the factors behind that quite sudden increase in productivity come 2025. Is there a particular reason? Are there underlying factors where by that stage you see productivity increasing?
I don't think that we have a crystal ball that tells us something special is happening at that point in time. That's in the outer years of our forecast, by which point we think the economy in Scotland will have returned to pre-COVID levels. So, you know, there will have been catch up at that point, and hopefully no more pandemics, and things will be motoring, as it were. But Francis, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just a small point, which is really just carrying on my previous point, which is, you know, as I've said before, we'll have this period with basically idle resources, because we'll have people in the wrong sectors and with the wrong training, whatever. But there will be those extra resources there, and we're anticipating that eventually, you know, those resources will begin to be used, and that's one of the factors behind that recovery in productivity, is that eventually, you know, the economy will start to sort itself out, and unused resources will begin to be applied in different areas, or the areas that have been very weak will begin to grow again.
And just one final follow-up, thank you. How sensitive are tax revenues to productivity growth? We've spoken about how earnings increasing will be one of the drivers of government income tax revenues. How big a part is productivity a driver in government income tax revenue?
John, let me turn to you to give a sensible response.
Well, because productivity is important here, because productivity growth, in a sense, is what drives earnings growth over the long run. So so if productivity grows, earnings grows, and therefore tax receipts grow. So there's that clear causal chain. We do publish this sort of sensitivity in some of our additional, they're not in our main report, but they're on our additional supplementary tables, and we can certainly let you know that reference. I don't have the figures to hand at the moment.
No, that's very helpful. That's all I had, Convener. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. Alistair Allen, please.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder if the panel could say anything about the scale of the changes that are likely to apply to the funding available to Scotland in 2021-22 compared to the year that goes before it. Obviously, I think I understand the reasons for that, but with if I'm reading it right, a 9.3% lower figure in the total figure, inclusive of COVID spending. I suppose my question is, am I reading that right? And secondly, how does Scotland prepare for budget change and fiscal change on that scale?
So just for clarification, are you referring to a reduction in COVID-related or pandemic-related funding when you say that?
Well, my understanding is that non-COVID funding will go up, but COVID-related funding will go down on such an enormous scale that obviously has an impact on how any country could possibly prepare.
So the quick response is that the COVID funding has been used for special programs and for special purposes to see us through the last year and some of this year, as anticipated, of extraordinary volatility and difficulty running a normal economy. And as the economy returns to its more normal operation, then the COVID funding becomes less necessary. But Alistair, I think I saw you nodding when the question was being asked. Did you want to say something? You're on mute.
Still on mute, yeah, Alistair. Broadcasting will get to you in a second, Alistair.
Well, sorry, Alistair Smith. Sorry, there were two Alistairs here.
Alistair. Yeah. Yes, that's a good description, Alistair. Just to follow up what Susan said, you're right, Mr. Allen. Let me call you that. To say that the overall funding envelope for the Scottish Government for next fiscal year is less than it was in this year. But the core funding, the non-core funding in the budget has actually increased. And as Susan said, the difference is that by the end of 2021, the Scottish Government was getting over £8 billion of additional funding related to COVID, whereas in the coming year's budget, that's estimated at the moment at £1.8 billion. So that's where the reduction in the overall funding envelope comes from. I don't want to use the word budget because we're not comparing like with like. We're comparing the total funding that was available to the Scottish Government by the end of the one fiscal year with the money that's been put into its budget at the beginning of the next fiscal year. So that's not a like for like comparison. And the way I would prefer to put the answer to your question, Mr. Allen, is that if it turns out that we have much less than 8.6 million of additional COVID funding in the budget next year, that's not so much a funding challenge for the government to have to deal with as a reflection on a reduction in the COVID challenge that the government has got to deal with. So we actually ought to hope that next year's budget will end up at the end of the year not having £8.6 billion of additional COVID funding in it, and that the actual amount of COVID funding will be close, maybe a bit more, maybe modestly more than the 1.8 billion that's in the current Scottish budget for the upcoming year. Because if that 1.8 billion doesn't rise substantially, it's because of good news, and there's less adjustment for the government to have to cope with in the coming year.
Thank you. And I suppose related to that point is looking forward, we all hope for better news this year. Some of the assumptions that both governments are making seem to be predicated on an increase in net tax revenues. Is that fair to say, or is that unfair to say? But are the assumptions that are being made there realistic?
Alistair, do you want to pick up on that?
The way that the fiscal system works is that if changes which governments anticipate in revenue more or less match each other, then the net effect on the Scottish budget is small. So in the past year, we have seen a very significant reduction in income tax revenue and significant changes in other devolved tax revenues like LBTT and the landfill tax. And some increases in social security, the cost of social security benefits. But each of these, because they're matched by effects in the wider UK economy, where income tax revenues have fallen, stamp duty revenue has fallen, landfill tax revenue has fallen, the effect on the budget is less. So if we expect, just to go back to income tax, we expect income tax revenue to rise next year, but we expect income tax revenue to rise in the UK at the same time. So the effect on the Scottish budget will be if the net take from the Scottish income tax revenue relative to the UK is different. So growth in revenues reflects an expectation both in the UK and both in the rest of the UK and in Scotland that the economy is going to recover, and that's good news. And of course, tax revenues will recover alongside it. If it turned out that the optimism wasn't justified, if, for example, let's hope this is not the case, if, for example, there were another wave of pandemic, then the tax revenue forecasts would turn out to be too optimistic, but that would probably be the case both in Scotland and the rest of the UK.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And finally to Alexander Burnett, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and members to my register of interests in construction and business. For the panel, my questions around the LBTT figures. We're seeing the axing of the Help to Buy Scotland scheme, a reduction in the First Home Fund. We're seeing the removal of the LBTT threshold holiday, which incidentally had produced higher revenues. And we're also seeing a 300 million reduction, or near 300 million reduction, in affordable homes provision. All of this would imply lower volumes and higher prices, which we're already starting to see early signs of, which is the opposite of your LBTT conclusions. And so I was wondering if you could maybe just explain some of the thoughts behind that, and also, just as a sort of minor point alongside that, your reduction in the prediction of Scottish landfill tax would also be counterintuitive, given the sector and the construction sector is the largest contributor to landfill tax. So the two would again seem counterintuitive. So I just wonder if you could explain some of the thinking behind that.
I'll just make one general comment and then turn either to John, who I think has a lot of detail to hand, or to Francis on this. It's interesting you mentioned LBTT. In England, there was the stamp duty relaxation, which was worth quite a lot of cash, if you will, to a buyer. In Scotland, there was a different accommodation made, which was to the level where LBTT kicks in, which was lower if you were to put a cash sum on it. If you look at the activity, the reduction in activity in housing transactions, they were very similar. They didn't seem to be. You couldn't say that one of those approaches made had a significant impact that was different from the other approach, which was interesting. Just an observation to make, but that was interesting. Would also point out that in the latter half of last year, the number of housing transactions grew quite significantly because they seem to have gone very quiet in the early days of lockdown, and then when it was possible and people were getting out and perhaps thinking we need to do something now, let's move. So there's a lot of behavior around these things. It's not simply how much is put on the table or not put on the table, but that by way of just a general comment in one of the areas you mentioned. John or Francis, do you want to come in more specifically on landfill tax or LBTT? Francis,
comment on LBTT. Yeah, I'm okay now. I think, so I'll make a general comment on LBTT, which I think sort of reinforces what Susan was saying, was that we are expecting, these forestalling effects, that people are changing the timing of their transactions according to the timing of tax changes. But we haven't, and the UK comparison sort of shows that we don't think that the tax situation has had an enormous impact on the housing market overall, and in the sense that the housing market has done relatively well. But I think that's, as far as we can judge, not been directly the responsibility of tax changes, but actually has just been a feature of this situation.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Alexander. Okay, can I thank the panel this morning for their very helpful and detailed evidence. I don't envy your job as forecasters and tasks in this very volatile and challenging environment we're currently in. I'm now going to suspend the meeting now for about 5 minutes, and we'll be ready to start at around 12 minutes past 10. And I'll put ready to start in the chat bar when we're ready to go. Again, thank you to the panel and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
I welcome the second panel to our meeting this morning, and can I say we'll need to conclude this particular piece of business by midday at the latest because of the business in the chamber. And I welcome to our second panel this morning, first of all, Kate Forbes, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Dougie McLaren, who's the Deputy Director of Public Spending, Lucy O'Carroll, who's the Director of Tax, and Graham Owenson from the Head of Local Government Finance. And with having said hello to the panel, I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some brief opening remarks if she wishes to do so.
Thank you very much, Convener. And yes, I will make some very brief remarks. I'm very grateful to the committee for its pre-budget report and also for the discussions that we have had and the flexibility regarding the process and the timetabling for this year's budget. Obviously, also separately speaking to party spokespersons in my endeavour to be as open as possible about the very fast-moving situation and the evolving funding position. The country, I think we would all agree, needs a budget to be passed that deals with the pandemic response and recovery and ensures continuity of support across the financial years. And accordingly, I'm very receptive to the committee's and the Parliament's responses. Listening briefly to the SFC just there demonstrates just how complex it is to set this budget in advance of the UK government with late consequentials this year, an uncertain economic outlook and the difficulties of managing forecasts at different points in time. In terms of the funding position, the budget I announced on the 28th of January does allocate everything available, but I expect that funding position change potentially quite significantly in the coming weeks due to the uncertainty of the final budget position for this year, as well as the demand-led nature of some of the schemes, particularly the business support schemes. And to that end, I'm mindful that we need to ensure that the end of this financial year isn't a cliff edge for businesses and public bodies alike. So managing funding across the financial years is hugely important. One point I do want to update committee on in terms of this financial year is business support. Last week, I announced I'd be doubling the local government discretionary fund, that's business support, which is entirely at the discretion of local authorities. In light of the fact that we're still in some form of national lockdown, I can confirm to the committee that I will instead quadruple it from the original £30 million to £120 million. The position for next year is of course contingent on the UK budget on the 3rd of March and indeed any late 2020-21 changes to either funding or flexibility, because I would also highlight to the committee a point that they already know, which is that the UK supplementary estimates still haven't been confirmed for this year's budget. So in the absence of a clear and timely settlement, I've endeavoured to make the budget process more meaningful by prudently assuming £500 million of consequentials from the UK government's COVID reserve to add to our initial allocation of £1.3 billion from the UK spending review. And I would reiterate that the COVID funding is non-recurring, so we need to target it accordingly as we look to maximise the impact of it. That is all I had to say as opening remarks. I hope they're helpful in reflecting the various moving parts to this whole budget process, and I'll of course keep the committee updated on any further developments, and I think I'll be back in front of you in the not too distant future anyway. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Good news about the discretionary funding. It probably gives me the chance to say thank you to our colleagues in local government for the remarkable way they've dealt with all the additional funding that's been provided for business support across the country and the job they've done. The Cabinet Secretary, as you noted in our pre-budget report, the Chancellor announced in the UK spending review he is considering business rates relief, but will do so in the light of the evolving situation. Since then, there's been some indication from the UK government that further support will be announced in the Chancellor's budget in March. I certainly saw a report that said that the Chancellor had said to councils in south of the border not to issue any business rates bills. I just wonder though, has the Treasury provided you yet with any further information about the level of business rates relief which the Chancellor may or may not announce in his budget?
The direct answer is that we've not had any indication yet from Treasury. As you can imagine, our respective officials are in touch regularly. Interest is being shown in what we've committed to for 2021-22, but we've not got anything about the UK government plans. And I certainly press my officials to use any means possible to try and get intelligence on this so that we can then plan accordingly. My view is that March is too late for something that's fundamental to be announced because businesses are making decisions right now. That's why I wanted to maximise any resources I had to avoid a cliff edge on the 31st of March. And our approach has been to at least extend it for another 3 months. I'll keep in close contact with Treasury on this, but our position remains that I want to extend it for the full year, but because we have to balance our budget, I have to use the resources available to me and therefore can only afford to extend it by 3 months at this point in time.
If the Chancellor does indeed provide business rates relief to 100% for the whole of the financial year 21-22, if I'm right, that will free up potentially an estimated 185 million in your own budget. I just wonder, therefore, can you provide the committee at this time with an indication of what your priority is likely to be in allocating that funding, if it does become available? I realise there's still that question. And would it be your intention to bring forward amendments to the bill or through in-year budget revisions?
My initial instinct would be to use that money to do even more for businesses in the early months of the year to help them emerge from closure or restrictions. I've been working with sector and business bodies to prepare some contingency options, which we could then deploy very quickly in the coming weeks, certainly in advance of year end, to deploy that further funding. Ultimately, I think that money should be used for business support. We've chosen to do it for non-domestic rates relief right now because that was the #1 ask from businesses. But I know that there are other asks from businesses, and my intention would be to use that for other economic priorities to support businesses.
Okay, finally from me, Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government's Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement recognises the effects of COVID-19. It says, layer on top of existing structural imbalances are predicted to be particularly severe for people on low incomes. I just wonder, therefore, can you set out how the budget for 2021-22 addresses this disproportionate impact in ways that are different from your last pre-COVID budget?
Thanks. So I'll say perhaps I've got 3 different elements, 2 of which actually build on our approach in previous years. So the first is on pay and the second is on tax. We have set out today we set out last week rather, a progressive pay policy for Scotland, which maintains a distinctive approach focused on reducing inequalities by ensuring that it's the lowest paid that gets the most significant uplift of 3%. The second is on tax. So tax will continue to be more progressive in terms of supporting lowest earners. But further and on top of that, in this budget in particular, you see a strong emphasis on reducing inequalities. So, for example, you'll see the Scottish Child Payment, £68 million in this year's budget. You can see a substantial building on last year of COVID funding to support communities through local government. So, for example, when it comes to free school meals, when it comes to supporting the third sector, and when it comes to ensuring that local authorities have the funding they need, whether it's for council tax reduction or other welfare support, they can continue to provide that support to families that have been disproportionately hard hit this year. Another example would be on council tax freeze, which we know, council tax not being the most flexible of instruments, we have chosen to freeze it to support households that are struggling. So that's just a quick overview in the way that we have used multiple different levers to try and support those who have been hardest hit and to meet that objective of tackling inequalities, which is one of the 3 priorities for this budget.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I now turn to Murdo Fraser, please?
Thank you, Convener. I think that's my mic on now. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I've got some questions around the local government settlement, but just before I come to that, I wonder if I can ask one follow-up to the Convener's first question, which is around the overall size of the budget. I mean, I think we're looking to the UK budget at the beginning of March to see if there might be additional resource available after that. But can I ask you, in relation to the draft budget you've presented, what account have you taken of in-year underspends for the current financial year and allocating those as part of that budget?
Thanks. It's a very good question because of two major reasons. The first is, I mentioned in my opening remarks, the demand-led nature of the schemes that we're operating. So if you take business support, for example, the Strategic Framework Business Fund is based on its demand-led, and therefore the nature of the lockdown in March will determine how much we're spending. So I'm very mindful of this being a very fast-moving situation, and that could deliver some underspends. Now, we will ensure that all of that is recycled into business support. So it's not leaving business support schemes, but it may be that that slips into next year. And managing, therefore, the funding position over both years is quite an important element this year compared with previous years. So I monitor that very, very closely, and we will ensure that no money is lost, but it might be that it slips into next year. But the other element to this is the late supplementary estimates. So that has not been confirmed yet. I hope that it will be confirmed in the coming weeks. The sooner the better, in my view, but that will finalise the allocations for this year. Now, I can't necessarily predict what that will be, but in previous years, we could have seen a reduction in the supplementary estimates. In fact, last year we saw a reduction in capital, for example. We this year have the guarantee. So this is a long-winded answer to say to you that there are two substantial contributions to the funding position, neither of which I have full control over, but both of which I monitor very closely. And the key will be not to lose the funding, but to ensure that it's recycled in the early part of next year. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful, and we'll see how that develops in coming weeks. I really wanted to ask you this morning about the local government settlement, because last week in committee we took evidence from Councillor Gail McGregor from COSLA, who I'm sure you will know well. According to SPICE, the Scottish Government's overall resource budget has increased from last year, or rather the current year, to next year by 11.2%. And yet your settlement for local government in terms of the core funding amounts to an increase of just 0.9%. So that looks like you are shortchanging local government, who of course have borne the brunt of many of the issues and responsibilities in relation to COVID, not least rolling out business support. And according to Councillor McGregor, even just meeting the Scottish Government's pay policy for local government employees, it's going to cost 195 million, which is double the amount of cash uplift you provided. So, do you think this is a fair settlement to local government, and how do you expect local government to meet their ongoing costs and commitments, given that you've given them a relatively low level of uplift compared to the uplift in your own budget?
Well, I do think, in short, that it is a very fair settlement. There will be a total funding package of £11.6 billion to local government through the finance settlement. But I would, in terms of the local government settlement, I would look at it in a sort of layered approach of three different funding sources. The first is that there is an increase, cash increase, in local government day-to-day spending for local revenue services. That's an increase of £335.6 million, equivalent to 3.1%. But over and above that, there was two other elements to the local government settlement. The first was the non-recurring COVID funding. Local government's been very clear, and they're right to be clear, about the impact that COVID has had, the pressures that COVID has put on their funding position. And so there was an additional £259 million to deal with COVID pressures as well. But the third element was that one of the major pressures is, of course, lost income, because local government receives money from ourselves, also generates income from fees, charges, and other income. They have lost much of that in the last year, And that's why I also announced a further increase of £110 million to the initial estimated £90 million to compensate councils for the loss of income from sales fees and charges. That brings the total to £200 million for this year. So overall, the funding settlement deals with the COVID pressures. There is an increase in the core settlement. That's a point that's accepted by COSLA as well as ourselves. And on top of that, compensation for lost income. In terms of pay, obviously pay is a matter for local government. We don't have a role in the negotiations with unions on pay, and local authorities will take that role. I have regular meetings both with COSLA as well as with trade unions. The only element of pay that I would mention in regard to the local government settlement is, of course, that there is an additional amount for social care that's transferred to local authorities from the health portfolio to support the implementation of the real living wage.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, I appreciate all that you're saying, but a lot of for example, the additional COVID monies going into local government are just putting them back in the position they would be in. And I think the point they would make, and I'm sure they've made it to you, is that the cost pressures continue to go up, not least from the pay settlement. They've estimated the revenue shortfall against what they need is 362 million for the coming year. So I suppose my question is, should there be additional funds becoming available to you, whether that's from UK Treasury or other means? Is more money for local government a priority for you?
I'd make a distinction between the COVID pressures again and the non-COVID pressures, because something like pay will need to come from non-COVID funding because it's recurring. I think that right across the budget, the 3rd of March is a very key date in terms of determining what further funding is available. And as we've seen over the last year, clearly within a matter of days, this year's budget was somewhat redundant because of the decisions taken by the UK government to provide us with additional funding. And that additional funding was then distributed, including to local government, over the course of the year. So I certainly, when it comes to this year's budget, don't think that there will be no further funding over the course of the next year. I think there will be further funding. Local government is on the front line in terms of distributing grants, in terms of welfare support. So yes, local government is a priority because local government's on the front line. And of course, in relation to cross-party discussions, which I've had with some parties already, if local government is a priority, then I'm very happy to look at how we can provide additional funding.
Okay, thank you. One final question, Convener, if I may, and that's in relation to the issue around council tax. You've provided an additional £90 million to councils if they agree to freeze the council tax for the coming year, and that's equivalent to a 3% rise in council tax. The big question that COSLA have asked us is, will that money then be baselined for future years? So are you able to answer that, please?
Well, it's very difficult, as you'll understand, for me to be setting next year's budget in advance of setting this year's budget. So in terms of council tax, we will take that into account in next year's budget, understanding the points that have been raised by COSLA to me this year. But I'm not in a position to determine what the envelope is for next year's budget, which is hopefully something that the committee will understand.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Fulton. Sorry. Thank you, Murdo. Fulton McGregor, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Sorry, Fulton, I'm just saying I never thought I'd mix you and Murdo up at any stage in my life, but there you go.
I think it's maybe the Fraser in the Fulton, maybe it's the Fs. But thanks, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. It's actually following on from Murdo Fraser's line of questioning there. And obviously you've already went over some of the main headline figures, the 335 million, 250 million one-off payment and the 90 million for council tax. Can I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, if you could expand a wee bit on how these figures link into the priorities for local government in terms of recovering from the pandemic, some of the main priority areas? And do you think, because I think at this stage everybody from all political parties, and you yourself will be aware, the government will put forward something, and obviously COSLA and local authorities will look to get a bit more. Is there anything you can say about the areas where you think there could be some discussion around in terms of recovering from the pandemic?
Yeah, one of the main reasons why the £259 million of non-recurring COVID-19 consequentials was de-ring-fenced is because I think local government needs that flexibility to address COVID-19 pressures in their particular areas. So that, for me, is quite important. They will, each of them, face different challenges. If you take something like the Lost Income Scheme, each local authority has a different dependency on lost income. Some will operate ALIOs, not all do. So I think having a pot there of the £259 million, which is free and flexible, as it were, for local authorities to use as they wish, is important. Alongside that, as part of the core settlement, there is additional funding for commitments that have been made. So, for example, the settlement will include an additional £59 million of revenue to meet our commitments, our joint commitments on expansion to funded early learning and childcare. I think that's a priority right across the Parliament chamber and right across local government. It also includes £11.3 million in additional discretionary housing support. It includes additional support for inter-island ferries, and so on and so forth. It includes some capital for flood prevention. Now, all of these are priorities which have been identified both by COSLA and by, I think, politicians across the chamber. So that is fully funded, and over and above that, there is also a pot of cash that local authorities can use as they determine the needs.
Thanks very much for that, Cabinet Secretary, and I apologise, you might hear my kids in the background here, the joys of the current situation. Can I ask a wee bit about, it was a question I asked last week to the panel members who were in, how has the council funding changed over the last year? You've talked about some of the more, the costs that they'll have incurred and the loss of income, but in some respects as well, there'll be less services done. So has there been any consideration that, has that sort of developed the priorities? And I suppose just on that kind of line of questioning, I've been quite impressed with the amount of money that the Scottish Government have given to community groups over the pandemic period. Is that factored into the budget? I mean, a lot of this has been announced by Elaine Campbell, and I done a bit of volunteering for one of the community groups in my constituency, and I was absolutely struck by just how much work they were doing. Thousands and thousands of vulnerable people they were seeing every week, and that was only one community group. And what struck me was that they were in effect taking pressure off the council as well by doing that, something that the council here actually recognised. So, is that all something, I know it's a bit of a muddled question, but is that all something that's been taken into account, and is there further commitments to these community groups as well?
So you touch on quite an important point of principle, which, I've said that whether it's business support, whether it's third sector support, there will be no cliff edge on the 31st of March. But I'm saying that knowing full well that only £1.3 billion of COVID consequentials have been confirmed by the UK government, and that figure may change on the 3rd of March. And so therefore, when it comes to providing a continuation of the funding to volunteers that you mentioned, which incidentally was, I think, the first decision we ever made on COVID consequentials last March, to be able to continue that is somewhat contingent on what the UK government does on the 3rd of March. And we have said in principle that we want to continue support, but some of that is dependent, a lot of that is dependent on what money is forthcoming. Now, I think it's highly likely that more money will be forthcoming on the 3rd of March. That's why we've already taken that prudent assumption of additional £500 million. But our priority will be to ensure that there is no cliff edge, because we're still in the throes of a pandemic, in terms of support for volunteers and support for third sector, and also support for business. So hopefully that answers your second part of the question. In terms of the first part of the question, over the last year, yes, funding for local government has changed quite substantially. There's been additional funding directly to compensate lost income. There's been additional funding that's been completely free and flexible for local government to use. And then there's been additional funding, for example, to help them manage business support grants. So over the coming year, we will continue to look at all these different pressures, and there may well be a need to revisit some of those funding pots. But I think this settlement, as it stands just now, in terms of the increase in day-to-day spending as part of the settlement, the COVID consequentials themselves, as well as the funding for lost income, sets local government up for the coming year and allows them to go ahead and set their own budgets in light of the figures that we've confirmed.
Thanks for that. Convener, one more question, if that's okay. And just to say, Cabinet Secretary, I know you like to hear good news stories from around the country, so I'd like to put on record that the North Lanarkshire Council business team have been absolutely superb in supporting local businesses and getting those grants out to people, from my point of view anyway, in my constituency. So the final question I've got is a wee bit different, but I'll try and relate it back to local authorities, to saying the good side of the convener, but it's to do with sort of local businesses that, you know, are maybe part of local infrastructures, and obviously then that links into the council and income for the council and such like. In the three areas which, you know, I've asked you about before, in nightclubs, soft plays and taxi drivers, all the areas I spoke about last week, and I really appreciate the funding that's been given to them. And I know you've answered this in the chamber, so I suppose it's just to give you the opportunity to put on the record again, will there be further consideration for these type of businesses, maybe not specifically just those three, but these type of businesses that, you know, may need to stay closed a wee bit longer, or will continue to be affected in the case of like taxi drivers until possibly hospitality returns to some sort of normality? Is that factored into your budget? Thanks.
Thanks. In terms of the principle, it's very similar to the last question, which was the approach of the government is to say that there will be no cliff edge on the 31st of March in terms of the Strategic Framework Business Fund and other ongoing supports. But we are making that commitment in the hope and the assumption that the UK government will continue its own business support schemes, and therefore that will generate consequential funding, which we can use to continue to pay out through our own Strategic Framework Fund. As Fulton McGregor will know, in October, nightclubs in the soft play sector were given grants of up to £50,000, having been closed since March. And since November, they've been eligible for the ongoing 4 weekly recurring payments from the Strategic Framework Fund. And last month, they would also have received the top-up payments of up to £9,000. So whilst there's no plans right now to augment that substantial funding to nightclubs and soft play businesses, clearly the future of the pandemic, as it evolves and as businesses need to stay closed for longer, we will keep all our business funding under review. You also talked about taxi drivers, and obviously the £57 million fund for taxi and private hire drivers went live in mid-January. That's grants of £1,500. By the beginning of this month, that has paid out almost £5 million. We're also engaging with the Scottish Taxi Federation to explore the case for taxi operators who are dealing with fixed costs. And members will be interested to know that statistics published today show that businesses have received £276 million through the Strategic Framework Business Fund, as well as the top-ups and the taxi driver fund. So I will keep all of the evolving needs of businesses under review in order to prioritise our limited resources and maximise impacts. But I think business support in particular shows one of the challenges we face with this budget, and that is the cliff edge at the 31st of March. The government's position is to extend support across the Strategic Framework Business Fund and across the third sector and to local government. But right now we're doing that in the hope that the UK government will provide clarity on the 3rd of March around our own funding position.
Okay, just before I go to Patrick Harvey, Cabinet Secretary, and thanks, Fulton. I noticed since we started that the sun's streaming in the Highlands on you. Is it causing an issue? Yeah, I'll let you do that before I go to Patrick.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
No worries. At least sunny here too, but 8 inches of snow. But there we go. Patrick Harvey, on you go.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to ask a question about the medium-term financial strategy first, and then maybe pull back after that and ask one or two specifics on this year's budget. How would you respond to the suggestion that the medium-term financial strategy, does have a useful role in providing a bit of a look ahead, but it isn't really strategic in the sense that it doesn't set out a general approach that the Scottish Government intends to take, for example, to future use of tax policy, particularly at a time when the whole of the UK is increasingly aware that recovery from the pandemic is going to have to involve some pretty deep searching questions about the role of taxation and potentially significant change to the forms of taxation. Do you think that the medium-term financial strategy needs to develop into something that is more of a strategy, more of a sense of setting out the Scottish Government's general direction of travel on issues like tax, spend, borrowing, and the potential for fiscal consolidation to result in further austerity measures?
So the MTFS obviously sets the context for budget decisions, and then actual decisions on tax and spend are reserved to the budget or a spending review. But I think where there's a legitimate question is around how we do multi-year spending or set out our approach to multi-year tax and spending plans. We have got a challenge right now on two fronts. One is that we're still awaiting a spending review from the UK Government. There were plans to do that last November, but due to the pandemic that has been delayed. We went ahead and did our own spending review on capital, which is the capital spending review that was published last week, but there is a need for a revenue spending review as well, which looks at the multi-year position to our tax and spend position. The MTFS instead is bringing together the risks to our funding and our spending outlooks. It will set out how we seek to manage them, the tools that are available to us. But given what we all know, that the UK budget decisions are a key determinant of the Scottish Government's funding position, the scope for setting out future spending plans is very limited. That might change once the UK Government sets out its own spending review, because in that sense we would then have a multi-year outlook on our own budget position. But it's very difficult to set out tax and spend over a 5-year period when A, much of our budget is dependent on what the UK Government does, and B, they haven't even done a spending review yet. So I am always interested in recommendations and suggestions for how we make the MTFS more useful and more helpful and bring greater clarity and transparency to our tax and spend decisions. But because of what we know about how critical the UK Government's decisions are, it's very difficult to do that without a UK Government spending review at the very least.
Yes, I appreciate the difficulty of the lack of a UK spending review, and I'm not suggesting that the medium-term financial strategy should set out year-by-year propositions for the specific use of specific taxes. But at the moment, if you're describing it as an outlook, then perhaps it's mislabeled in calling it a strategy. Surely a strategy would set out a general approach, not specific year-by-year tax propositions for future years, but a general approach to the role of taxation, the potential changes that are under consideration for the role of taxation, and how the Scottish Government intends to strike the balance between protecting public services, protecting households' incomes, and avoiding austerity measures.
I mean, obviously, to that end, in terms of expected tax revenues in Scotland is built in to our central funding scenario. one thing I was keen that the MTFS did do this year was to set out the risks over the next 5 years and how we were going to deal with them. So in that sense, it was strategic in setting out what some of those challenges would be. On the spending side, for example, we're on track to increase spending on the health service and what impact that has on other spending areas which have to be found from an ever decreasing share of the overall budget, or issues around population, demographics, pressure on various services and how we would deal with that. The MTFS does go into detail on the case for further borrowing, further use of the reserve, as well as tax powers as well, in terms of setting out a strategy for how we deal with those risks. But if there are suggestions, recommendations for how we provide more detail, then I'm certainly very happy to consider them. But we did try quite hard this year to set out what our risks are over the coming 5 years and how we would contend with them through tax, through borrowing, and through reserve as well.
Okay, just pulling back from the MTFS then and looking at specific measures proposed for the coming financial year. Murdo Fraser was asking you about the council tax freeze that you've proposed, you put to COSLA, and I think you place that within the context of a general intention to support household budgets, to reduce poverty and inequality, and to target help where it's most needed. Can I ask what other policy options were considered alongside a council tax freeze? For example, you could be looking at child payment uplift, you could be looking at expanding eligibility for free public transport as we emerge from the pandemic, you could be looking at free school meals, you could be looking at anything more than half measures on rent controls. There's a number of ways that you could benefit household budgets that would direct that support to those most in need. What policy options did you consider alongside the council tax freeze, and what level of assessment led you to conclude that freezing the council tax, which saves the most money for people in big houses, is the most effective way of targeting support for household budgets at those who need that help the most?
And of course, the premise of the question is one that I would disagree with, because I don't think it needs to be one or the other. And on the council tax freeze, as you can imagine, in building the budget, we are looking at a whole host of different policies to ensure we use our funding as effectively as possible. I think we are all on record, or almost all of us on record, at highlighting the ways in which council tax is not as progressive as it could be, and therefore a council tax freeze is quite a blunt way of protecting households, because it's very difficult to deliver a more nuanced approach, although increasing the council tax reduction, which is what we did at the beginning of last year, is one way of doing that. So I don't think it needs to be one or the other, and it sits alongside a substantial increase in the Scottish Child Payment. The £68 million is in the budget. There's a total investment of almost £3.6 billion for social security. And we know that in 2019-20, the progress report on tackling child poverty suggested that we were spending around £2 billion targeted at low-income households. I would expect that to be a very similar amount for this year as well. So we will look at other policy areas. We, I think, in this budget have very explicitly and intentionally ensured that we prioritise tackling inequality, which has grown through the pandemic. I'm always open to other suggestions for how we do that faster, better, more effectively, but I don't think it needs to be one or the other, council tax freeze or tackling inequality.
Okay, thank you. It does sound as though you're recognising that the council tax freeze does nothing for the people and the households who are most in need. They save the least from it, but that there is room for movement on other aspects of this. My final question is in relation to commitments that were given by the First Minister in FMQs on a number of occasions in the last year, saying that for there to be a green recovery from COVID, requires a step change in investment in areas like energy efficiency and fuel poverty. There doesn't seem to be one. So when and why was the decision taken not to follow through on the First Minister's words on that?
Well, respectfully, I would disagree with that. I think that looking at our budget just now, you see the delivery of a number of commitments that have been made, particularly around infrastructure. So I firmly believe that investing in infrastructure will be a key part of our recovery. And we face choices as to whether to invest in low carbon infrastructure or carbon intensive infrastructure. And we have included in the capital spending review that the 2 billion low carbon fund to be spent over the next 5 years, central to which is an investment of around £1.6 billion in heat and energy efficiency in our homes and buildings, therefore trying to meet both our climate change targets as well as revitalising our economy. But there are other elements in the budget too, which try and shift behaviour as well as transitioning to a low carbon economy, including investment on active travel. There is a 5-year commitment of over 500 million to enable us to invest in large scale programmes around active travel. And so all together, and that's not even talking about what we're doing on employability, where again, through our employability initiatives and our reskilling initiatives, we've got a Green Workforce Academy. So what we're trying to do is not just invest for the sake of economic recovery, but invest with a view to recovering the economy and transitioning to a low carbon economy at the same time. None of it is perfect. Some of it will take time, particularly as we emerge from the pandemic. Choosing the right time to make those investments, I think, is quite important as well. For example, on supporting buses, supporting public transport. Public transport has required a substantial, a huge amount of funding over the last year to help them just to survive. I think there will come a point at which we can then start to move that funding into more efficient public transport as well.
Yeah, there's probably quite a lot we could pick up on there, but I suspect the convener would like to move on to other members. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Patrick, you're right. Thank you very much. Alistair Allen, please.
Okay, Convener, Cabinet Secretary, just a couple of brief questions. Obviously this year you've had to deal with additional spending, but a lot of that additional spending has been demand-led rather than easily predictable for you. You've mentioned some of the plans that you have around that and coping mechanisms for that, but have you factored in any contingency that demand is not as high as your forecast from month to month?
Yeah, we have to do that, and without repeating myself, I think managing that cliff edge from a business perspective, they are not interested in what my pressures are coming to year end. They just want to know that the funding they can access in April is the same as the funding they can access in March. And therefore, for me, knowing that there is a major cut-off point on the 31st of March makes it very difficult to provide that assurance on funding in April. And so what I've tried to do with this budget is, of course, assume £500 million of additional funding for next year. I think there will be more funding forthcoming, but it is really important this year of all years that we have flexibility around the year end. Now, the SFC made clear that the shock, the economic shock, has enabled us to have slightly more powers with regards to that transition from one year to the next. But it's a position I'm managing right up to the wire this year, and any funds that had been allocated but not spent this year will still need to be spent next year, for example, in health or in business support. So it's one thing that I would invite a committee to consider quite carefully, how we manage that year-end cut-off, knowing that there may still be late consequentials or there may still be a reduction in demand, but that demand will continue into April, which I need to manage.
You mentioned how you have to manage that business support, and again, much of this is demand led. So, if it's possible to predict the volatility within business support, what are the areas that present the most challenges in terms of that volatility and in terms of managing the flexibility that you mentioned, such as it exists?
Well, if I take two examples, if I take business and I take health. So on business support, we are obviously still all in a national lockdown of sorts. That will probably continue for a while yet. And therefore, in March, it's likely that demand for the Strategic Framework Business Fund will still be high. But it's also likely that some businesses may struggle to resume trading in April. And therefore, that Strategic Framework Business Fund will need to continue to pay in April. So any reductions in certain funds now could be recycled in the Strategic Framework Business Fund, but from April. So therefore, you see that it's not the need that has reduced, but it's just the need has moved later. It's the same with employability. We had originally assumed that with the end of furlough last autumn, our employability and skills programmes would see a huge uptick, but they didn't, because because of furlough has been extended to the end of April now, and therefore it's likely that we see an increase in unemployment from the end of April, and therefore those schemes which had funding allocated this year will need to have funding allocated next year. So managing it across the year end is so important. It's not that the need has gone away, it's just that when that need needs to be drawn down, it will be in the next financial year. And we, as a government, were only able to draw down from our reserve the grand total of £250 million. Now, that has changed slightly due to the Scotland shock, but there's still a need to manage that funding over 2 years. It's the same with the health service. If you think of the need to continue to fund Test to Protect, the need to continue to fund vaccination programmes, it's not that we can front load everything into March. There will still be a need in April, but I have a very hard finish on the 31st of March because I'm unable to be as flexible as I would like in moving funding between both years. The need is still there, the funding need is still there, but where it falls is actually out with my control, but I need to still ensure that there's funding in place, whether it's this year or next year.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Alistair. James Kelly, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can I turn to the issue of housing? Housing is obviously important in the budget in terms of addressing the housing shortage and also supporting the construction sector. It was therefore a surprise that the More Homes budget was reduced by £268 million. So given the backdrop to housing and the importance of those issues, can I ask why the housing budget was penalised?
The very simple answer to that is that in the spending review of last November, the biggest cut was to capital, of which the biggest proportion was to financial transactions. And financial transactions, the bulk of which would normally support affordable home ownership and investment in charitable bonds, therefore, has taken the biggest cut when we move into next year's budget. Now, what I can't predict is whether the UK government will change their approach on the 3rd of March in terms of restoring the capital and the FTs that have been cut. But our cut to FTs, which has had a knock-on impact on housing commitments, is largely because of the UK government's decisions around reducing their housing commitments in all parts of the UK. So the capital reduction reflects the levelling of expenditure over the next 5 years. Now, we know that we have led the way in the delivery of affordable housing across the UK, almost 97,000 affordable homes delivered since 2007. The need to continue to support that affordable housing supply programme is more important than ever before. And so we have used our financial transactions and capital as far as we possibly can by bolstering that programme over the next 5-year period. But my position is that if we see a restoration of FTs or capital at the UK government's budget, then we can revisit that approach that we've taken in this budget.
Yeah, sorry, James, you're mute still, James. Apologies. The broadcast will get to you. I don't know if it's. Are you still mute, or is it a technical issue?
I'm on.
You try again, James. I can hear you now.
Okay, thanks, convener. Apologies for that. Of course, it is a Scottish Government budget, and it's for the Scottish Government to make the decisions around budget allocations and housing. Just in one specific consequence of this, Homes for Scotland have drawn attention to the reduction in the First Homes Fund, which is crucial in terms of helping first-time buyers onto the housing market, supporting them in purchasing new or second-hand homes, and also takes pressure off other areas of the housing market, the private rented sector and the social housing sector. And, Homes for Scotland have raised a legitimate concern, I would say, that that budget has been reduced to £60 million, a reduction of 70%. And, that will constrain opportunities that first-time buyers have had in previous years.
On the first point, that it's the Scottish Government's job to prioritise, I agree, but there has been a 67% cut to the total Scottish Government financial transactions budget. It's not a small cut, it's huge in terms of the overall context, and that helps to fund our affordable housing programme. So where limited FTs are available, we have deployed them firstly to our priorities. And within the available budget, we have protected support for the SME house building sector through retaining Help to Buy smaller developers scheme with a budget of £14 million. We have also, as you just said, we will reopen the First Home Fund with a budget of £60 million, and the Open Market Shared Equity Scheme will continue with a budget of £44 million, and a further £10 million will fund applications already approved for the main Help to Buy scheme. So within the smaller pool of funding we have available, we have tried to stretch them as far as possible and get the benefit of every last penny by prioritising the schemes that help the most. And when it comes to affordable housing, it's so important that there is a broad package of support available, because different parts of the country, different house builders and different individuals and family circumstances will make use of different schemes. So all of that is part of a very broad range of support available. Would I like to go further? Absolutely. And if there is a restoration of the financial transactions budget, then I will consider that.
Okay, thank you. That's me, convener.
Thank you, James. Dean Lockhart, please.
Thanks very much, convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to follow up on the budget for affordable housing. Cabinet Secretary, you said that the £270 million cut in the affordable housing budget, which is under the More Homes line item in Table 505 of the budget document, you said that £270 million cut was because of a reduction in financial transactions funding. But looking at Annex G of the Scottish Government budget document, this shows that FT funding available to the Scottish Government is only declining by £100 million, which is significantly less than the £270 million reduction in the affordable housing budget. So just wonder if the Cabinet Secretary can explain why there is such a large cut in the affordable housing budget, given that FT money is only going down by a much lower amount.
So, and it needs to be looked at the broader context of the reduction to capital and FT's reduction to capital of 5%. And in terms of the overall need for capital, Dean Lockhart has regularly asked me questions about the Scottish National Investment Bank. So we have obviously protected FTs going to the Scottish National Investment Bank, and we have also tried to protect as far as we can the affordable housing programme. But you can either salami slice the smaller pool of FTs and achieve less overall, or you can prioritise the two main beneficiaries of FTs, which is the National Investment Bank and Affordable Housing Programme, and that is the approach that we have taken. But that 67% cut in FTs does have an impact and does have a bearing on what we can do. The capital cut also has a bearing and an impact on what we can do. Now, I don't know if any officials want to come in on any of that to complement what I have just said on affordable homes. But in terms of the figures, they're quite clear that last November, there was a 5% cut in capital, a big bulk of which is FTs. FTs are required for the Affordable Housing Supply Programme as well as for the Scottish National Investment Bank. And as far as we can, we've pushed the value of every last penny of that to ensure that the Scottish National Investment Bank can play a key role in economic recovery, and so can a continued provision of the Affordable Housing Supply Programme.
I'm not seeing any R's in the chat bar from your. Oh, Dougie's got his finger up though. Dougie, if in future, can folk put in the chat bar, because I can't always see who people are. Dougie McLaren, please.
Thank you, convener. Just very quickly on Mr. Lockhart's point that I think he referred to Annex G in the budget document having a cut in FTs of around 100 million. That's actually from 2019-20. The table in Annex G is based on 2019-20 with reference to the National Infrastructure Mission. So the profile it was a bit different in comparison to 2020-21. It's a much greater cut between 2021 and 21-22, as the Cabinet Secretary referred to. Thanks.
Dean, back to you.
Thank you, convener. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the Scottish National Investment Bank, and I would like to take you up on that discussion, because last year the bank was allocated £240 million, and for this upcoming year the bank is being allocated £205 million. That's a total of £450 million. One of the missions of the bank, as you know, is to increase the availability of housing options as part of its place-based mission. As I understand it, to date, the bank has announced investments of only £10 million, leaving a budget of £440 million of the bank's budget available for the remainder of this financial year and next year. Will you consider using some of the bank's budget to make up for the cuts to the affordable housing budget, given that's part of the bank's mission statement?
If that is Dean Lockhart's request, I'm quite surprised by that, because I think every other time I've been at committee, he has asked me about ensuring that there's adequate support for the Scottish National Investment Bank. Now, there are choices to be made here, but I think the Scottish National Investment Bank is going to play a very critical role when it comes to economic recovery, and affordable housing, yes, is part of its remit, and that is a timely reminder that when it comes to affordable housing, the point I just made, which is that there is a broad package of support to ensuring that there is affordable housing supplies, then the Scottish National Investment Bank will also play a role in other deals as part of its three core missions. So I'm quite surprised if he's suggesting that we gut the Scottish National Investment Bank to provide support to the affordable housing. Of course, I would rather not be in the position of robbing Peter to pay Paul. I would rather that the 5% cut to our budget, not a result of what we've decided, but as a result of what the UK government has decided, was restored. And I hope that the UK government will restore that cut on the 3rd of March.
One follow-up, if I may, convener, and as I understand it, the revenue budget, total revenue budget available to the Scottish Government has increased by something like 11%. But, Cabinet Secretary, the reason I'm focused on the budget of the Scottish National Investment Bank is because £240 million was allocated to the bank for this current financial year, which ends in 6 weeks' time. The bank was only set up 8 weeks ago, and to date it has only announced one investment of £10 million, leaving a balance of budget for the bank for this current financial year that ends in 6 weeks' time of £230 million. That's a lot of money to spend in 6 weeks. So I just wondered if the Cabinet Secretary could tell us what's going on with the budget for the Scottish National Investment Bank. How is that money going to be spent? Is all of that £230 million going to be spent in the balance of this financial year, which is 6 weeks' time?
Well, you'll be most relieved to know that that is not how we budget. We don't provide or allocate funding and then wait to the last possible moment to use it. We, particularly during the pandemic, have made sure that we use every penny at our disposal to respond to COVID. And in previous sessions at committee, he will recall that I have come and done budget revisions to revise the allocation. And for example, FTs have been used to provide support, loan form to businesses and other things. So we have not let FTs, as it were, sit there unused, but we have throughout this year ensured that every penny is going towards responding to the pandemic, and that includes FTs.
Okay, but just to clarify, there is significant excess budget available at the Scottish Investment Bank has not been used. Is that what you're confirming?
No, I'm confirming the opposite of that.
So just to clarify, just one, if I make it, the budget for the bank this year was 240 million, and there is only 6 weeks left of this financial year for that budget to be spent. Do you know roughly how much the bank has invested in this current financial year?
Well, the bank has only been operational since November 2020, so it's fairly recent, and it's already getting into the business of doing deals. But the point I'm making to Dean Lockhart is it's not as though the budget that was agreed last March is the budget that we have just abandoned. We have used that budget, we have used funding right across all the different lines to respond to COVID. We have used FTs to respond to a number of different priority areas, largely through loans. It's not that we leave FTs untouched. We don't leave anything untouched. We're constantly ensuring that we're getting the best value from the money that we have. And next year's budget allocates £200 million of fresh capital for investment next year. There will be some, I assume, towards the outturn statement, which it will be in a couple of months' time. There will be clarity on what the bank has actually used versus what we budgeted it would be used, largely as a result of changing priorities over the course of this year because of the pandemic.
I would be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could write to the committee to confirm how much the bank has invested of that £240 million budget. I think that would be very useful.
Okay, well, thanks, Dean. I think the Cabinet Secretary has heard that request. John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. I mean, Dean Lockhart just seemed a bit confused about the financial transactions funding, so I wonder if we can pin down the numbers. The figures I saw were that for 2021, there was 606 million financial transaction funding, and that is falling to 208 million, which is something like 2/3. Is that roughly the correct figures?
Yeah, that's right. So I mentioned the figure of 67% reduction.
That's great. Thanks so much. Now, to go on to other questions, the SFC, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, has suggested that after the pandemic, by about 2025, the economy will still be some 3% less well off than it would have been if we hadn't had the pandemic. Can the Cabinet Secretary say anything about how we tackle that going forward in the longer term?
Well, I said on the budget statement that if this budget had any overarching priority, it was economic recovery and job creation. And I think, based on those figures that John Mason has just quoted, investment in new jobs and protecting jobs is absolutely essential to our future prosperity. And in this budget, there is more than £1 billion to drive forward that national ambition for jobs and to equip our workforce with the future skills they need. Now, as part of that, it tries to ensure that nobody is left behind. So, for example, there's a £125 million investment targeted at employment support, including the National Transition Training Fund, to help people reskill and upskill, as well as the Young Person's Guarantee to ensure that everybody under the age of 24 has an apprenticeship, a job or an education opportunity. There's also £230 million for Skills Development Scotland, which is a small increase. And to Patrick Harvey's question earlier, we know that if our economy is going to transition to a green recovery, then we need to ensure that there is the pipeline of skills required. And so there's an opportunity here to both provide reskilling and upskilling opportunities and ensure we have the right kind of skills in the pipeline. That's why the Green Jobs Workforce Academy is there to help people to retrain to secure work in the low carbon economy. So there's a lot of different reskilling, upskilling, employability programs in place. The reason why there are so many is because we recognise that people will be at a different stage with different skill sets. That sits alongside the substantial capital investment over the next 5 years to inject confidence in the economy, as well as ensuring that we're doing things on the margins, like the productivity clubs, in conjunction with the SCDI.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary very much for that answer. Well, we're also speaking to the SFC about the fact that there's a Scotland-specific shock, and that's allowing us a bit more flexibility, and we can borrow in the short term. Now, we then discussed the fact that by about 2024-25, there's the possibility that we'd have to have reconciliations to get back from that. And the SFC seemed quite relaxed about that and seemed to feel we shouldn't worry too much about 2024-25. So I was just wondering if that was also the feeling of the Cabinet Secretary, or what her thoughts were on that issue.
Well, whoever is the Finance Secretary in 2024-25 will need to contend with that. But what all of that illustrates, I think, is the risks, and this was brought out in the SFC's evidence as well, of basing a Scottish budget on the interaction of two sets of forecasts made by different forecasters at different points in time. And the current circumstances exacerbate that uncertainty. And whilst these are very technical conversations, they have real life impacts. We've just talked about the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, we've talked about Scottish National Investment Bank, we could talk about the Health Service and other things. All of these programmes, initiatives, services rely on real money, and that real money is determined by forecasters, two sets of forecasters. So we have based our budget on the best information that we have available today. I can't second guess the scale of any future reconciliation, as the net position is only going to become clear once outturn data is available in the summer of 2023. We will, and it is one point that's helpful from the UK government, we will have the choice to use provisional or UK budget BGAs. We'll take that decision like we did last year after the UK budget when the position is clear, although adopting updated BGAs might not necessarily reduce the risk of reconciliations. There have been additional flexibilities triggered by the economic shock, but all of that also illustrates that we need adequate and sufficient flexibilities in order to manage these risks. These are not risks necessarily of our own making. Indeed, dare I say it, these are not risks necessarily of the UK government's making either. But our request and our plea to the UK government is to work with us in managing those risks, not for my benefit, not for the benefit of the government, not to make Parliament's life easier, but because those risks have real-term consequences, real-life consequences for our public services as well.
Again, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. And she mentions risks quite a lot there. And so my final area would be this 500 million that we're assuming is coming from Westminster as part of the COVID funding. Can she give us a little bit of her thinking around that 500 million? I mean, why that figure? Could it have been more? Could it be less? Have we any indication from Westminster what's happening?
Because that £500 million is essentially unconfirmed funding, I had to take quite a prudent decision when it comes to the value. And that 500 million is a prudent assessment of the likely additional funding we expect to receive. Now, that is based on the £21 billion that the UK government have set aside but haven't yet allocated. So one point that's very interesting to reflect on is, of course, some of the opposition complaining about the contingency funding I had set aside to manage all demand-led schemes up to the end of March, and the constant criticism that we should be allocating and spending every penny immediately. Well, perhaps that would be better taken up with the UK government, who, interestingly enough, have taken a very similar approach to setting aside £21 billion that hasn't as yet been allocated, I assume, because they will allocate it in their own budget. That 500 million is a prudent assessment of what we would likely receive. Of course, the UK government may not follow through with allocating that £21 billion that they've set aside. If that's the case, I'll have to reassess the overall funding position, but I remain committed to prioritising COVID funding on the basis of the allocations I presented in the budget, and I can't wait for the UK government to make announcements. I have to, right now, provide that assurance to local government, to the health service, to taxpayers, and that's why we have chosen to go ahead of the UK government, although it does mean that there's far higher levels of risk in our budget assumptions.
Thanks very much, Convener.
Right, thank you, John. Alexander Burnett, please.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you touched on in an earlier answer to John Mason about productivity, and I think we all recognise productivity being a key part of the economy, and we've talked about it here many times before about how it's not performing as we would hope. Our own committee advisor says we've been hoping for productivity growth to return for 15 years, but it hasn't. So can I just ask you, what do you think you're doing differently in this year's budget to buck that trend?
Yes, it's a good question. And for me, one of the key drivers of productivity, well, there's probably two key drivers for productivity in this budget. And I say all this with the understanding that you'll just have listened to the SFC. These are hugely uncertain times. The economy is going to look very different, both because of intentional decisions that we make and also just because of changed behaviour as a result of the pandemic. And one of the key drivers for me is better tech and better digitalisation right across the board. So it was a major reason for commissioning the Mark Logan report on creating a digital ecosystem. A lot of businesses have had to move to digitising their work, both in terms of internally and externally in terms of their engagement with customers and consumers. And that is a key driver for productivity, doing things better, smarter. And one of the examples of that was with the digital development grant, where for the last few years, that digital development grant has sat at about £1 to £2 million with decent take-up, but not huge take-up, the kind of take-up I would have liked to have seen for employers to use that funding to digitise their operations. And yet, in the course of about 3 hours, we saw £10 million being applied for. So I think there has been a substantial transition. So to answer your question, one of the things that the budget does is build on that. It builds on the recommendations from Mark Logan, and it builds on our approach to providing businesses with the tools that they need to digitise, to make better use of tech. Tech was already forecast to be the second fastest growing sector in Scotland over the next 5 years. So to accelerate that approach when it comes to productivity. But the second element, really briefly, is on population and on ensuring that our workforce have the right skills. And again, coming out of the pandemic, if we get our employability approach right, if we get the reskilling and the upskilling approach right, and we tailor that to the jobs available and the jobs that will be available over the next 5 years and 10 years, then I think we could see a real marked shift in productivity in Scotland.
Thank you very much. And no more questions, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Tom Arthur, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I really just have one question, and it's around the theme of well-being budgeting and a well-being economy. I think over the past 12 months, we've all had cause to reflect upon the meaning of well-being and ask what really matters in life and what matters in terms of public policy. I think alongside that, we've seen many of the shibboleths of conventional economic funding, particularly around borrowing and sustainability of public debt, be questioned. And I think there's perhaps an opportunity to be informed by the experience of 12 months, both in the changed economic landscape and in the collective experience of living through the pandemic, to refresh how we think about what our purposes are behind budgeting and public policy more widely. I just wondered if the Cabinet Secretary can reflect, given that the Scottish Government has been pursuing wellbeing budgeting for some time now, particularly through the National Performance Framework, what the experience of the changed economic landscape and the collective societal experience of the last year, how that informs decisions taken around budgeting and priorities, not just in this budget here, but in the longer term as well.
Thanks. I think Tom Arthur's question is so important because we often use the term well-being economies or well-being outcomes, and it's really important to pin down and define what we mean. And if committee members haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend looking at the report that was published by the Scottish Government just before Christmas, which was the National Performance Framework Impact of COVID-19 on National Outcomes, and how that has informed spending plans and other Scottish Government decisions, because I think monitoring and accountability of whether we are actually delivering on our national outcomes is so important. I don't think any of us across party lines would disagree on the national outcomes in the National Performance Framework, but aligning that with the choices for spend is so important. And both the budget and the medium-term financial strategy focus resource on delivering our approach to the programme for government, and the programme for government was very much based on the National Performance Framework. So the delivery of the approach in this budget is directly informed by the analysis and the evidence from the December report I just mentioned. And it's why I basically boiled down the three priorities in this budget to, quite simply, economic recovery, tackling inequalities, and the ongoing health response, to ensure that every penny we are spending is contributing towards those outcomes. There are many things that a government can do. We have many priorities, and I'm sure, as will emerge in cross-party discussions, there are priorities right across the parliamentary chamber. We have choices to make, and with limited pools of funding, and that's not just because we have to deliver a balanced budget, but because in a pandemic there are huge needs. We've got to make choices, and the choices we have made in this budget are very much to align it with the National Performance Framework, which is the most tangible descriptor, the most tangible outcomes we have of what a well-being budget looks like.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. No further questions, Convener.
Okay, Tom. Cabinet Secretary, one final question from me. I'm sorry, it's a very technical question. I just want to ask this for the purposes of our record. We are discussing the issue of borrowing for forecast error on income tax with the SFC. And it might be you have to write to me about the specifics, or maybe one of the officials can deal with it if it's too technical, so forgive me. So, on clarification on borrowing for forecast error on income tax, is that borrowing against the net income tax position once outturn figures have been published? Is that the situation?
I'm very happy to bring in any officials on what our borrowing limits is. And perhaps Lucy, do you want to come in around our borrowing?
Yes, I'm happy to come in. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Scottish Government and Treasury have agreed that we can unlock resource borrowing powers for forecast error based on any negative differences between forecast and outturn budget positions. So we can borrow for the total negative effects of forecast errors subject to the overall limits. Forecast errors that result in increased funding for the Scottish Government budget do not reduce the government's ability to borrow. So resource borrowing can be drawn down at any point in the financial year. We can change our plans at any point and draw down more or less than planned, subject to the overall limits and the evident existence of reductions in funding caused by forecast error. But it is those overall negative effects, not the net impact. There's no netting off of positive errors.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much, Lucy. And can I say thank you to the Cabinet Secretary too for our helpful responses to our questions this morning. And we expect to publish our report on the budget later this month. We have no further public items on our agenda today. So I now close this meeting, and can I just wish everybody a good day, and thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.